Hi, today is April 20th, 2016. In the last a little less than a year, I've been getting into comic books, and I'm reasonably well into it now. You know, I'm still a baby beginner comic book nerd, but I'm sorting myself out. And so what I am going to share with you today is a couple of tips that either worked for me or would have worked for me if I had thought of them at the time in my initial getting into of comics. Now let me be clear, these are not rules. There are no rules. These are some ways to do it more easily. This is my number one tip that supersedes all of the other tips. If you have friends who are into comics, borrow from them mercilessly. I mean it. If they have a Comixology account, ask them to let you use their password and read what they have. If they have hard copies of comics, borrow those. And in return, because this is not a one-sided deal, these are your friends, you don't want to take from them without giving something back. So what you're going to do is that you're going to read those stories in a timely manner, and then you are going to obsess with your friends about their favorite comics. That's your job. That's how you be a good friend and comic book geek at the same time. It is entirely possible to be a fan of Marvel and DC. However, to start them both at the same time is overwhelming. This is one of the ones that I did not do and kind of regret. You can choose them pretty arbitrarily. There's good stuff on both sides. But, you know, both of them are massive multiverses, and it's just too much for a person to try to make sense of two completely disparate, decades-long continuities at the same time. So chill out, pick a side. Doesn't mean you can't turn coat later. It's really easy to spend a lot of money on comics without noticing it. Especially if you're on like Comixology and you just have to click on a thing and it doesn't even feel like you're spending money, and they're not even that expensive, they're like less than $2. Yet before you know it, you've spent $20 on comics in one sitting. Don't let it be a disaster for you. Decide how much money you're going to spend on comics. Is it $5? Is it $50? Depends on your personal finances, however. Decide what you're going to do, and then stick with it. Group titles are great because, one, they usually have only run for like a certain period. You know, they get together to do a mission, and then they leave. And what the advantage of it is that it introduces you to a lot of characters at once, and you can decide who you're interested in pursuing further. If you want a more specific recommendation, I think you should start with Young Avengers, because they're great and because they tie in to lots of different parts of the world. It's kind of like getting a comics sampler. Like, here are all of these kinds of people who you might care about. Regardless of whether you started with a group comic or not, pick a character from your group comic, from stuff you've heard from the movies, and follow them. Characters don't cameo in each other's stories all the time. Characters are in group stories all the time. It's a really good way to sort of expand your knowledge once you've found somebody you love, is that you follow them down a tangent, and then from that tangent you find somebody else who you love, and you follow that person down a tangent. And before you know it, you have a pretty decent sense of the universe and a number of different characters whose stories you're following. If you're like me, spoilers don't worry you very much. So this is pretty easy advice for you to follow. But if you're like you, Abe, and spoilers are very important to you, this is going to be hard advice to accept. But I honestly think it's vastly important, because when you're dealing with like 80 years of comics, you're not going to know every single thing that happened. And people are going to refer to stuff in the comics, and you're not going to know what they are. And you just kind of have to roll with it. You have to say, okay, I don't know what this is. That's fine. If you care a lot, you can look up the comic it's in. You can go onto a wiki and read all about it. But in that moment, when you're reading the comic and they're referring to something and it's kind of important to the plot, but you can get the gist of it, just get the gist of it. You don't need to know every detail. Just keep going. If you don't do this, you're going to get so hung up on knowing every piece of context and every piece of the universe that you're going to get overwhelmed and you're going to drop it, and comics are not going to be fun for you anymore. I will see you on Saturday.